So many different directions you could go with a film about Fred Rogers. But Micah and Noah, my understanding is the slice that you decided to take on came from research you did and a series of letters. Can you talk about finding those letters and what it was about them that made you think this is the direction we need to go in?
Yeah. So we've been working on this movie for 10 years. It'll be 10 years in January. And in the course of those years, we found ourselves trying to find the right way into this story. We realized quickly that Fred Rogers was not the ideal subject for this traditional kind of 3-act biopic. That we actually needed to do was to look at the people in Fred's life, whose life he affected. And we were in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, in the western part of the state, where Fred Rogers' archive is, where he grew up. And we had read Tom Junod's article before, but what we hadn't actually seen was this trove of letters. We were there in the archive. We were wearing these sort of cotton archival gloves to make sure we didn't get our hands on everything. And in this box were about 200 letters that Fred and Tom exchanged over the course of 5 years until Fred died in 2003. And it was deep. It was about everything. It was about this relationship that we built the movie into. And we said, this is the movie.
In that first scene, that setup, that guy took my breath away. Marielle, but it felt like it had to be a little bit of a risk with such an icon, such an American treasure, and then you open up the pocket door and you see Lloyd's battered face. Talk about your approach.
Well, we never really questioned that this was going to be the opening of the movie, that we were going to start with this kind of larger framing device, which I loved in the script. But once we filmed it, we realized, I think, what a risk it was. Both in just starting right out the bat with Tom Hanks coming in the door, we realized that audiences' minds were kind of doing acrobats, because you start the movie and you see the familiar miniature and the stoplight and the couch, and it all feels like, oh, I recognize this. This looks exactly like I remember. And then the door opens and you see Tom Hanks and you're like, no, that's not it. And you have a moment where your brain has to kind of catch up. And we realized everyone has to get used to this guy as this person that they loved. And we figured out, we had moments where we kind of toyed with, is this the right approach to the beginning of the movie or not? But we realized we got to go in the deep end. You just have to get used to this. And so we're going to sit with it, and we're going to sit with it for a long time, and we're going to do it all in one take, and we're going to really take our time. And yes, and then we have this moment where you open the picture door, which was a real episode of Mr. Rogers, where he had this very similar looking picture door. So this very familiar thing, if you're very familiar with the program, that he did, and then having this introduction to Lloyd with his bloody face. I don't know. I thought it was great. I loved it from the beginning.
Yeah.
But we knew it was weird.
It was also challenging on the day because it's against your instinct. Like, we had multiple cameras, and you want to also, it was not easy for Tom to go through. And Mari really was so disciplined to keeping us all on track, because you have an instinct to being like, well, let's make it a little bit easier. Let's cut. Let's move around, and to just be kind of, to keep the integrity of it. It was
we worked with the rules of the show.
Yeah.
And they shot the show in very specific ways. So, for example, we had 3 cameras. We filmed on these old tube cameras that they filmed on. And the way they would film on the original show is someone was calling live, and one camera would light up on top, and that was the camera that was live. So that's what we did.
Yeah.
But we could have filmed all 3 cameras.
Yeah.
But we didn't, because we really wanted it to be that he was only looking at whichever camera was on, and that it had that sort of cutting pattern. And if you're cutting, if you were cutting to another camera, he wouldn't be looking. It was sticking to difficult rules, but in order to stick with the authentic recreation of the show.
Which sounds like it was important. I'm sorry, just jump in here for a moment, because anybody who's ever encountered Tom Hanks, he works at a different pace and a different rhythm than that. And maybe, Matt, can you talk about the difference between Tom in real life, Tom on that screen, and Mari? Maybe you could talk about how you got him there.
Well, I can speak to on behalf of Tom Hanks for the first time and say that Mari was like with the reins going slow down, as she kind of, and he said he struggled. That's his tempo. He moves at the speed of light, as you said, and for him to take his time took a great deal of effort.
He does. I mean, you guys have similar energy in real life. Like, you're both really quick. You're always joking around. There's a lot of energy. Tom drinks a lot of coffee, and the idea in casting you was we were trying to get opposite energies. In many ways, we were trying to kind of show these two men who are foils for each other, who both believe that they're helping the world, but they have different perspectives on how they're helping the world. One inherently believes people are good, and one inherently believes people are bad, and that their job is to expose that truth to the world. And but that part of that is that there has to be this meeting of these two energies and these two worlds, Pittsburgh and New York, Tom and Lloyd. It's these two sides of a coin. And that did mean with Tom, it's not just slowing him down, though. It was actually kind of changing his, like, DNA, his energy of his whole body. I mean, it was really finding stillness. Because what happens when you slow down a fast person is it comes out in, like, little ways, you know? Like, it has to go somewhere. So it was really like a meditation every day to kind of pull him into a different way of being, almost like doing Tai Chi or something. But it was actually kind of slowing his whole being down.
Can you talk about, I mean, I'd love to hear from you two about how that impacted how you think the film came out, because it could have potentially be filmed anywhere, but it wasn't.
Do you want to? I was just going to say, like, it's all in line with this, sort of the beginnings of this project, which were, we couldn't do this by ourselves. We had to have the Fred Rogers estate and his widow, Joanne, and Bill Eisler, who ran his company. They all needed to be part of this, and they all needed to not only give us the thumbs up, but, like, kind of hold our hands as we went through it. Like, it was very important to us, which is one of the reasons why it took 10 years. And so I think, like, we came with that energy. So Joanne was giving it back.
Yeah, there were times when I remember I was up with Arjun and Jade Healy, our costume designer and our production designer, in Joanne's apartment. And Joanne would just be handing this artwork, say, "Oh, Jade, here, this could be for the so-and-so set." And Arjun, at one point, she invited Arjun and I to go in and actually just pick whatever we wanted out of the closet, which was still stuff of Fred's there. And it was just amazing to be there and open up the closet and be able to walk through. And Arjun's pulling ties out and all that stuff. And like Mari had said, a lot of that stuff is in the movie. It's either in the set or it's it's or Tom's wearing.
I think it just made us feel good to be
It
like,
did,
we have
yeah.
these little Mr. McFeely bag that he wears was the real Mr. McFeely bag, and David Newell came to set that day and brought the bag, and he wore the bag.
And it's not just the props; it's also the people. In the scene in the Chinese restaurant, that's actually Joanne Rogers. That's the real Bill Eisler. That's Margie and Hedda, who worked with Fred for many years. When the camera sweeps around, we invited them there that day to sort of hold that space for all of us.
And shooting in the studio was, like Mari had mentioned, you could really feel the vibes there. I did. I felt like that. It was
we felt like we felt Fred, the reverberations of Fred everywhere we went.
One of the things, I mean, this is obviously a film about Fred Rogers, but this is also very much a film about fatherhood. And I'm curious, as a father, Matthew, what it was like of a young boy. I mean, because you don't see a lot of, I feel, genuine depictions of new parenthood and fatherhood. I mean, even that moment of, is the baby down? Like, oh, thank God that they acknowledge that the baby's asleep. Because in most TVs and films, like, the baby just disappears. But as a mother, I'll tell you that never happens. So what was it like for you, Matthew?
Yeah, no, Mari was very strong on that point. The scene where warm up the milk, and you'd said time and time again, you don't see this in movies, and we have to do this, and it should be addressed, and it should be a journey for you to go on throughout the film. And as the deep kind of research of Fred Rogers I did, in thinking I certainly was one type of parent, and my parents were great, but I thought I'll never be like them. And then I realized I was absolutely like them. And as a result of Fred Rogers' philosophies, I hope that I have slowed myself a little more and listen and don't tell my 3-year-old about everything.
I mean, we're all parents here. So much of what we were doing when we were working on the script and in the early prep phases was talking about what this meant to us as parents particularly. And Lloyd's journey was so relatable to me, because I think this big emotional thing happens for a lot of us when you have a kid for the first time, where your own childhood comes into reflection in this major way. Who you want to be in the world, your own mortality, like all this stuff comes crashing in, and we don't talk about that. You talk all about the kid, but you don't really talk about what your own emotional journey is when you became a parent, and how potent that period of time is, made worse by the fact that nobody's sleeping. But it is like it's a very potent emotional time. And there was this idea for me of, we only see certain versions. I mean, that what you pointed out is exactly something that makes me crazy. Of like, why is there never a baby crying? Why is that baby always ignored? You know, we don't show true depictions of children. We also don't show a really wide variety of masculinity on screen. For me, part of the appeal of making a movie about Mr. Rogers was it's a version of masculinity that scares a lot of people. He has ways of being that people might traditionally think of as more feminine, and but also with Lloyd's character showing a man who's his version of trying to become better is not just to become better at his job or what, it's also trying to become a better human being and a better father and a better husband. And these images of him, it shouldn't be radical, but it weirdly feels radical to show a man caring for his baby, warming up milk, singing to his baby, crying, hugging his father, saying I'm sorry, saying I love you. You know, I grew up with men for whom this is not something that's rare. You know, I grew up with feeling men in my household, and I'm married to a feeling man, but I don't feel.
And you're on stage with some.
And I'm on
right
stage
now.
with a whole line of them who wrote this beautiful movie. But I don't feel like we see that on screen. I mean,
Unless
this
it's
isn't
a
a version
joke,
of
right?
masculinity we get to see. We don't get to honor that version of men. And we talked early on about how important that was to all of us.
Not to like turn this into some kind of group therapy, but that's sort of what the making of this movie was. I mean, I think it has informed in profound ways the ways that we approach parenting ourselves. You know, I think our natural instinct when your kid is, you know, having feelings, is sad, is upset, is screaming, is crying, is to say, you know, don't do that. Let me distract you away from these feelings. Let me fill this void. Let me fill this silence with something. And I think what Fred Rogers taught us as parents, or taught me as a parent, is that your job as a father is not to deny those feelings, but to make your child feel safe in them, and to hold space for your child. And that is, I think, spiritually what we're trying to do in the movie, is to hold space for feelings.
I think it was the genesis as well. I mean, what you're talking about, Mari, was, you know, when we started, I was like a brand new dad and not very good at it. And I think that the insecurities that I was feeling, you know, I had a newborn and an almost 2-year-old. And in sort of a moment of I don't know what else to do, I put on Fred Rogers. And my super stubborn 2-year-old turned to the screen and started doing calisthenics with Fred. And I was like, Micah, this guy, this Fred Rogers is a warlock. And he speaks toddler, and we must write about him.
Thank you all for such a beautiful film.